Good morning. If we haven't met, my name is David Hollis, and I am, I think, perpetually auditioning for the role of permanent guest preacher. So we'll see if that ever takes. Today, I want to welcome you to worship. We are concluding the sermon series that we have been engaged in, Fresh Start, as we've been looking through the Gospel of Matthew. And today, as we consider the notion of fresh starts, I want to ask you if you remember how old you were when someone first asked you, what do you want to do when you grow up? Or what do you want to be when you grow up? Does anyone remember either how old they were or anybody really, really bold and want to yell out what the answer to that was? I heard two people at once.
A ballerina.
A ballerina. Whoa! Kismet. What? I heard one other person.
Artist.
An artist. And you are that. So that worked out. Mine was a doctor. My mom was a nurse, and I would sometimes tag along with her. They would have gatherings where they'd have food around the holidays, and I always admired the doctors because they would come in and they would eat and they would leave. And I said, that's the job for me. The nurses, were always doing all this really scary looking stuff, and I said, I don't want any part of that, but I could get next to what the doctors are doing. And that lasted until junior year of high school, when I met something called Chemistry 2 Honors. And we did not agree with one another very well. And I had a great teacher, Mr. Chandler, who was patient and kind, and he made learning fun. And I just was not getting it. And one day he kind of took me aside, and he said, David, you have really important gifts. And whatever you choose to do in life, you're going to be just fine. Just please don't do anything that involves chemistry. And I held up my end of the bargain. So here I am before you today. I did in college find the perfect career for me. It just came off like a light, and that, of course, is writing sarcastic and often passive-aggressive emails. I've yet to figure out how to make money off of that, but the dream is still alive somewhere. So all of us, again, we probably have those moments in our lives where we remember either someone saying to us, you really have this as a gift, or you really should think about doing this. And that's what's happening somewhat in this story in Matthew. It's a story of calling. Jesus is walking by the Sea of Galilee, and he sees these people out in a boat, and they're fishing. And he calls to them and he says, follow me and I will make you fish for people. And they drop everything and they follow him. It is the definition of fresh start, right? And as we've discussed already, these are the people who we will eventually call the disciples. They are Jesus' closest followers. Disciples really actually means like someone who is taught. So they're being taught the ways of Jesus, and they're learning by seeing him and following him. And we don't really know very much about them. We kind of have like different history traditions that tell us different things about the disciples' backgrounds. We're not really sure how old they were. A lot of different things that we're not sure about. But what we do know is that Jesus saw them and he believed that they could follow him and that they could do the same work he's doing. And in fact, he tells them all the time, you are going to do the work I'm doing. You're going to do, and he says at one point, you're going to do even greater things than what I'm doing. And so they are being called to the same ministry as Jesus, what Jesus is doing. Now, sometimes when we talk about being called to ministry, I think we have a confusion over what that means. I think we have made it so that if someone is called to ministry, what that means is that they become a pastor. And that's kind of like the only way that someone can be called to ministry. And that's clearly not what is happening in this story. That's not what's happening in anywhere in the New Testament. Again, we've kind of, I think, gotten things mixed up about that. Because what Jesus is saying is, I'm calling all of you to ministry. And I'm calling you also, at the end of Matthew's gospel, we have a passage that's usually called the Great Commission, where Jesus says to the disciples, this is after the resurrection, and he's basically talking to them for the last time, and he says to them, go therefore into all the world and make more disciples. Baptize them and teach them how to follow me with their lives. And they did that. They continued making disciples. And that continued for generations. And the only reason any of us is here today is because someone discipled us. Someone who was discipled by someone who was discipled by someone all the way back to Jesus was a disciple for us and taught us the ways of Jesus. And that's how we ended up here. We are disciples. We are on the road to being like Jesus with our lives. Now, pastors are included in that, sure, but pastors are not the only ones who are called to ministry. Our pastors at this church are incredibly gifted. I've known several of them for, more than just the time that I've been at this church. And their heart for Jesus, their heart for each of you, their heart for this community and this world is so full of God's love. And so please show them appreciation in the SPRC appreciation drive. Show them how much, tell them how much they mean. And also, as amazing as each one of those pastors is, not a single one of them is Jesus. Only Jesus is Jesus. Jesus is Jesus. Everyone else who follows Jesus is a disciple. So, all of us who are following Jesus are called to ministry. The only real question is, how are we going to live that out? And it's clear to me that by what Jesus is doing here and what Jesus continues to do in the rest of the New Testament, that there's really no way to live out discipleship apart from a community. Jesus calls us into community. The disciples are a community. And then the churches in the New Testament are communities. And we have to have a community because we have to learn from each other about God. I am a pastor. I don't believe for a single moment that I know more about God than any of you. I know different things about God because of what I've experienced and what I've studied and what has happened in my life and the things I believe that God has led me to, but I don't know more about God or better about God. And you know things that I don't know because of what you have lived through and what God has put on your heart. So God has given us this community in which to learn about God. We need to tap into and receive from the wisdom of our church members who are older and who have lived through transitions in life that some of us have not yet faced. We need their wisdom. We need their courage and their strength. That is part of what it means to grow into discipleship. We need the youngest among us, their enthusiasm. The number of times Jesus talked about the faith of a child. In first service, we had a baby who was praising God, and it was great, and I loved it. As a preacher, sometimes when that's happening, I start to think, oh my gosh, but I kept reminding myself, no, there are so many communities of faith right now that don't have a single child, don't have a single youth. Those churches are struggling, and they're worried if they're going to go on living as a community of faith. And we are so blessed to have the children, the youth, the babies that we have in our community. We don't need to shush them or tell them to quiet down. We need to learn from them what it is that excites them about God. What is it that when they see something happening, they think that's not fair? How can we pour into them that they are called to ministry? Not when they grow up, right now. They're called to ministry right now, as we all are. I think if we fail to recognize the community piece of all of this, that this story of people just randomly seeing a person and then dropping everything and jumping out of the boat, leaving their dad in the boat, as a father, that terrifies me. I realize that generally my children are, more or less one moment away from just saying, peace out, old man. And, again, one of them is saying that to me right now. And so they leave him in the boat. And that just sounds crazy. That sounds like a fairy tale. That sounds like nothing that could ever really happen. And yet, there are people in this room right now who have left a job, who have left safety and security, and have left everything that made sense because something was burning in their heart or something was bothering their gut, and they had to do something about it. And we need to share those stories. That's one of the reasons that one of my favorite things that happens here is the series, My Story, My Song. When we get to hear from all of you who share the ways in which God has moved in your life and called you to do things and brought you to new ways of discipleship. Maybe again, that hasn't happened to you or hasn't happened to you yet. But I want you to think for a moment about, is there someone right now whose work you so admire or whose life is so powerfully attractive to you in what they're doing for good in the world? And just imagine that sometime tomorrow that person shows up at your house or at your school or at your job and says, I want you to come and work with me. I need you to be part of the work that we're doing for good in the world. You might not just, pack up your cubicle and run out the door. Some of you might, some of you are ready to, but you would probably think about it. You would probably go home that night and think, gosh, can I do that? Is that a thing? Is that something someone could do? And we need to know who those people are for you so that we can support each other in taking those steps. If I know the people who you would, walk out the door for, then I know what makes you alive, what your calling is all about. I'll go ahead and tell you mine, and I think I've talked about him before. I'm blessed with a really, really poor memory. So if you're ever like, gosh, this guy repeats himself, I don't know that I'm repeating myself. I'm just saying what I'm saying. But one of the people for me, there are probably 2 or 3 people that I think if they showed up tomorrow, I'd be like, I'll think about it. And one of those people is a man named Brian Stevenson. Brian Stevenson is an attorney. He has mostly worked with people who are on death row. And he founded an organization called Equal Justice Initiative that's in Montgomery, Alabama. It's an incredible organization. At some point, I want us to take a field trip because I've never been. I've gotten very close to being able to go, but Montgomery's not that far. We can figure it out. And so Brian, a few years ago, wrote a book called Just Mercy. That book was made into a pretty big deal movie. Maybe you've read the book, maybe you've seen the movie. If you haven't done either, I'm a fan of starting with the book, but do you with that. And it's really, really good. And there is also, for me, as you can tell by looking at me, I'm a documentary nerd. So, the most wonderful words I hear are when Katie says to me, "Can we watch a documentary?" And I'm like, yes, we will. And so there's a documentary called True Justice, Brian Stevenson's Fight for Equality. I know it's available on a lot of different services. I think there may be a thing that rhymes with Bluetooth that you could stream it on for free. I hope I don't get sued for that. He is a lawyer, so I'm worried. Melissa will defend me if that needs to happen. But it's a powerful documentary. And again, anytime you take a book and put it into a movie, there's some stuff that gets lost on the floor. This documentary is just it's everything. I can't watch it without crying, which, as most of you know, is not a big deal because I cry at most things. But one of the most meaningful pieces of the documentary is that when he returns to the church that he grew up in. He grew up in a little church called Prospect African Methodist Episcopal Church. And he talks about how, as a little boy, he played piano in one of the services in that church, JB. And he got to hear people share about the struggles of their lives and the things that they were facing. And then toward the end of their witness and their testimony, they would praise God for getting them through and getting them to where they are. And he would, play to their witness. And that was so transformative and meaningful in his life. He shares more about moments in that church that show up for him all the time in his work. He is doing the work of Christ, and he's a lawyer. No offense. But even Jesus had some trouble with lawyers here and there, right? When Jesus calls the people fishing, notice what he says to them. He says, "I want you to do exactly what you're doing, but just do it differently and for me." He doesn't give them an entirely new job. He's not saying to them, "You're going to be crane operators now." He's saying, "I want you to keep doing what you're doing and do it for me." So you don't have to change your career. You don't have to leave everything behind. You can do what you're doing, and a lot of you are already doing what you're doing for Jesus. We can help each other see the ways of doing that more clearly. Before I started the job that I have now, I worked with college students. I was a campus minister, and so pretty much every day of my life was, again, someone coming to me who failed Chem 2 honors and saying, "I can't do this anymore." And I'm like, "Yeah, I know, right?" And so we would talk about, what are you going to do now? And we would talk about gifts and passion, and we'd talk about how if you're not living out those gifts and your passion, then no matter what you do, no matter how prestigious you are, no matter how many titles you have or letters after your name, or how much money you make, you're going to feel empty. It's not going to be great because you have a calling. And you've got to follow that calling. And then because I loved them so much, I was honest with them. And I said, in living out your calling and following your gifts and your passions, you may not make a dime. You may not be able to make a living. Because God really never talks about making a living. God says, here's your life. I've given you a life. I've given you a calling. I've given you a community. Here's everything you need. Come and follow me. In the name of the living God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.